Welcome to the Explainer. So, let me ask you a question. How does a monster earthquake off the coast of Russia connect to, say, a company's stock price? Or to a political decision happening in West Africa, or even a brand new breakthrough in particle physics? You know, on the surface, these things just feel like random, totally isolated bits of news. But here's the thing, they aren't. Today, we are going to dive deep into the global headlines from just one single day, July 30th, 2025, to show you the hidden threads, the invisible architecture that actually holds our world together. We're going to show you that what happens in one corner of the planet creates these ripples that are felt thousands of miles away and often in ways you would never, ever expect. So, let's connect the dots.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll start with a physical event that literally connected the entire planet. Then, we'll follow those shockwaves through the global economy right into the messy world of politics and power. And then finally, we'll look to the future, at the very frontiers of science and our environment. All right, part one, a planet connected. Our story kicks off not with some abstract idea, but with an event of just raw physical power. It's an undeniable display of how connected we are, and it starts with something that literally shook the world.
An 8.8 magnitude earthquake. It strikes in the Sea of Okhotsk, just off Russia's eastern coast. Now, to put that number into perspective for you, this is one of the 8 most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. Ever. The energy that was released is, well, it's almost impossible to even wrap your head around. Early reports describe the seabed just dropping violently, displacing this colossal amount of water and creating waves 10 to 12 feet high near the epicenter. It's a really profound and honestly a humbling reminder of the immense geological forces that are just constantly churning away right under our feet.
And the effect was immediate. It was a cascade. This was not a local event. Within minutes, it became a pan-Pacific one. Tsunami warnings, the highest level of alert, they just lit up screens at emergency centers in Japan, Hawaii, and Russia's own Far East. Evacuation orders went out immediately for coastal towns. But the ripples didn't stop there. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued alerts for this huge arc of humanity. China, the entire U.S. West Coast from California up to Alaska, the Philippines, Indonesia, Guam, even as far south as Peru and Ecuador's Galapagos Islands. Think about that. A single tremor in one remote spot put half the world on high alert.
And this, right here, illustrates the core idea of our entire explainer today. If a physical shockwave can travel thousands of miles in just minutes, forcing countries, continents apart to react at the exact same time, it just begs the question, what about the other kinds of shockwaves? The ones we can't actually feel under our feet? How do economic meltdowns, or political decisions, or scientific discoveries, how do they ripple through our incredibly interconnected global system? Let's find out.
Okay, part two. The economic tightrope. Now we're shifting gears. We're moving from those geological fault lines to economic ones, where what looks like stability on the surface can often be hiding some really deep and really significant risks.
So, on the surface, the headline from the IMF, it seems like pretty good news. They've nudged their global growth forecast up, just a little bit, to 3.0% for 2025. But you just have to dig one layer deeper, and you find this incredibly stark warning. The IMF makes it crystal clear that this tiny upgrade isn't because the economy is fundamentally healthy. No, it's mostly because of a temporary surge in exports from some countries over to the United States. They call this resilience fragile for a reason. When they say risks remain firmly to the downside, what they're really talking about are the big, scary problems still lurking under the surface. Unresolved trade tensions, inflation that's still stubbornly high in some places, and just mountains of global debt. The takeaway is this. The global economy is not on solid ground. It's walking a tightrope, and the wind is picking up. Now let's zoom in on a key engine of that global economy, China. This chart, this reveals a really worrying trend. Industrial profits are falling right across the board. And just look at the state-owned firms. These are the giants of the economy. Their profits are down a staggering 7.6% in just the first half of the year. Now, the sources say this isn't about some trade war. It's about weakness at home. Sluggish domestic demand. People and companies inside China just aren't buying enough stuff. So why does this matter to the rest of the world? Well, a slowdown in Chinese spending means less demand for German cars, for Brazilian iron ore, for Australian wine.
And if this slump continues, global companies that have built their entire business models around Chinese manufacturing, they could be forced into a really painful and expensive process of completely rethinking their supply chains. That would reshape the very map of international trade.
You know, economic decisions don't just exist on some spreadsheet. They have immediate real-world consequences. And this table shows a brutal example. In Angola, the government made a really tough call to cut long-standing fuel subsidies. This is a move, by the way, that's often encouraged by lenders like the IMF to help stabilize a country's finances. But for regular people, this meant an instant spike in the cost of everything: transportation, food, just daily life. The result on the street? It was instantaneous, and it was violent. Protests just erupted in the capital, Luanda, leading to 4 reported deaths, widespread looting, and over 500 arrests. This is a textbook case of that incredibly fragile balance between the big macroeconomic policies decided in places like Washington and the microeconomic reality people face on the ground.
Now, while some economic shocks are sudden, others are like these slow-moving tremors that build up over decades. This timeline reveals a massive one that's hitting Latin America. The entire region is aging faster than any other region in human history. Just think about this for a second. European nations had more than 100 years to gradually adapt our economies and social systems as they went from being young societies to old ones. Latin America is on track to make that same huge transition in less than 40 years. This incredible speed is creating a demographic time crunch. It poses a severe, almost existential risk to their pension systems, their healthcare, their future productivity. It means they need massive, forward-thinking policy changes right now to avoid a full-blown crisis down the road.
Okay, part 3, power, politics, and pressure. See, these economic pressures we've been talking about, they don't exist in a vacuum. They are deeply, deeply tangled up in a complex web of global politics, power struggles, and constantly shifting alliances.
China's foreign policy on this single day is a perfect example of this complexity. You have to look at this 2-track strategy they're playing. On one hand, you have the global collaborator. Beijing is out there proposing a new world AI organization under the UN, trying to position itself as a responsible leader in tech, talking about safety, ethics, and bridging the AI divide. But on the exact same day, you have the regional dominator. The foreign ministry is furiously condemning the military cooperation between the US and the Philippines, and it's issuing these stern warnings to Japan about its security rhetoric. It's like they're playing 2 different games at once, projecting soft power to the world and hard power to their neighbors. Understanding this balancing act is absolutely crucial.
Meanwhile, the relationship between the 2 biggest economies on the planet, it's stuck in this tense holding pattern. The latest high-level talks in Stockholm ended without any real breakthroughs. So for now, those multi-billion-dollar tariffs from the trade war, they're still in place. And there's this big cloud of uncertainty hanging over an August 12th deadline to extend the current pause. All the really hard issues, like market access for foreign companies in China and the incredibly sensitive issue of stopping the flow of fentanyl precursors, they're all still on the table, totally unresolved. For global markets, for businesses trying to make plans, this stalemate just means that unpredictability is the only thing that's certain.
Shifting gears to another global flashpoint where words carry enormous political weight. At a recent conference, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made this really powerful statement. Now look, the UN's support for a 2-state solution isn't new, but the specific wording here is what's so important. By calling statehood a right, not a reward, he is deliberately shifting the conversation. He's moving it away from the idea that it's some kind of prize to be won in negotiations or a treat to be given out for good behavior. Instead, he's grounding the entire issue in the fundamental principles of international law in the UN Charter, specifically the right of all peoples to self-determination. It's a subtle change in language, but on the world's biggest stage, it's a profound one. And speaking of powerful words, France has just taken a pretty significant diplomatic step. The French government has now officially classified violence by some Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank as terrorism. Now, coming from a major European power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council that's normally very careful with its language, this is a big deal. It marks a noticeable hardening of their official stance. Using the word terrorism elevates the issue beyond just simple crime. It signals a growing international impatience with the situation on the ground. and it could have wider diplomatic effects, maybe influencing other EU nations and ratcheting up the pressure in international bodies.
And while all these international pressures are swirling, we see these completely different stories of governance playing out inside nations. In the Ivory Coast, the 83-year-old president announced he's going for a controversial fourth term, a move that was only possible because his main rivals were legally disqualified from even running. This just feeds into a really worrying trend in the region of democratic backsliding. But then, on the same day, you look at Colombia. In a truly historic verdict, former President Álvaro Uribe, one of the country's most powerful political figures for decades, has been convicted of witness tampering. Here you have a figure that many thought was untouchable being held accountable by the justice system. These two events, side by side, paint this vivid picture of the global push and pull between the erosion of democracy and the fight to hold power accountable.
All right, our last section, Part 4, Our Future at the Frontier. We're going to finish by looking at the frontiers of science and the environment. And this is a space where incredible human progress and really grave danger often exist right next to each other, creating some of the most dramatic tensions of our time.
This slide presents a juxtaposition that is, well, it's just stunning. On one side, you have the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency proposing to overturn its 2009 endangerment finding. Now, this is not just some minor rule change. That finding is the core legal foundation, the bedrock that lets the EPA regulate greenhouse gases in the first place. Getting rid of it would basically dismantle the legal basis for a huge chunk of America's federal climate policy. At the exact same time, the Pan American Health Organization is issuing an urgent warning about the growing health crises across the Americas, from dengue fever spreading to new places, to severe heat stress, to respiratory illnesses from wildfire smoke, all driven by record heat and extreme weather. Their message couldn't be clearer. Climate action is public health action. The contrast is just stark.
Now let's go to the coldest place on Earth, Antarctica, where two really worrying stories are coming together. First, the commercial catch of krill, these tiny shrimp-like creatures that are the very base of the Antarctic food web, it has surged to a record high of over 500,000 tons. This isn't just about fishing. Krill are the keystone species. Taking them out of the ecosystem threatens the survival of literally everything that eats them, from penguins and seals to the great whales. And at the same time, more than 170 top scientists are sounding the alarm that the U.S. is about to lose its only dedicated Antarctic research icebreaker. Losing this ship would cripple our ability to do vital research, to even study and understand the very damage we're causing to this fragile ecosystem. So we're threatening the food web while simultaneously risking our ability to even see the consequences.
Yet, even as we face these huge challenges, human ingenuity just keeps pushing the limits of what's possible. Engineers have developed these ultra-rugged computer chips that are designed to survive inside the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. This is one of the most extreme radiation environments on our planet, a place that would just fry normal electronics in a heartbeat. Why does this matter? Well, because these tough new chips let scientists put sensors closer to the particle collisions than ever before. This helps them gather more precise data to help unlock the fundamental secrets of our universe, answering questions about the nature of matter, energy, and where everything came from. It's a perfect example of technology driving pure discovery.
And you see that same drive for progress on a national scale. In Australia, a company attempted the first sovereign orbital launch from Australian soil in over 50 years. Now, the launch was scrubbed at the last minute because of high winds. That's a common thing in the rocket business. But the attempt itself is the real story here. Developing the ability to put your own satellites in orbit without having to rely on another country, that marks your arrival as a serious player in the booming global space economy. It's about technological independence, national security, and carving out a future in what's becoming an incredibly critical domain.
So you see, it all comes back to this one idea: interconnectedness. We started with a physical earthquake, whose tremors were felt across the entire ocean. But we saw its echoes in the global economy, connecting IMF forecasts to street protests in Angola. We saw it in politics, where a single statement in New York can reverberate all the way to the Middle East. And we saw it at the frontiers of science, where our greatest hopes run right alongside our gravest warnings. Every single headline we've looked at today is a thread in one single, vast, and deeply interwoven global fabric.
And that brings us to the most important point, seeing these headlines not as just isolated events, but as parts of a bigger, dynamic system. That is what it means to really understand the world today. These ripples, geological, economic, political, scientific, they're constantly shaping our reality. So the question I want to leave you with is this. If a single 24-hour period can show us this many hidden connections, what are the invisible forces, the subtle tremors that are shaping your world right now? Understanding them is the first step to navigating our incredible, complex, and constantly changing world. Follow us on Spotify and YouTube to listen to this podcast every morning at 8 a.m.